Okay, and now the next section is on an institutional analysis, historical, philosophical, and political risk. Over the past 95 years, society and the economy have witnessed great prosperity, wars, depressions, recessions, and revolutions. We have just witnessed a revolution in the political economic ideological thought, from Keynesianism to Monetarism, and in its wake, institutional deconstruction, destruction, and market failure. And the question is, and the question will be, what social, political, and economic institutional synthesis will develop out of the financial crisis, and how will history judge us, and how will we be remembered? Paul Kennedy wrote The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. His thesis was that as governments expand and expand globally, politically, militarily, that they will need the resources to be able to pay for those expansion for those militaries. The only place you can get the money to pay is through taxation, debt issuance, and monetization or inflation of that debt in those currencies. So over the long run, specific military expenditures correlate strongly with available resources and economic durability. Military overstretch or overreach with relative decline are consistent threats facing powers whose ambitions and security require great resources. The need for additional capital, natural, human, technological, land, to pay for overextended military expansion and geographic presence, governments are forced to print money, which creates hyperinflation, issue bonds, high borrowing costs, and raise taxes, which has a negative multiplier effect in the real economy. This eventually leads to a devaluation in sovereign currencies, inflation, negative wealth effects, social unrest, stagnation, and decline. And if you look back at other financial crises, you can see that they were manifested through corruption or through overextension, through militarization, or nationalization of their economies that eventually led to a currency and an economic and a debt failure. And you can go back, and I won't go through all of them, but you can see the consistency. So what I did was I went back 90 years and looked at institutional shifts and institutional deconstructions and failures that had occurred. And I used the Hegelian dialectic as the model, because the accounting and the finance models and even the economic models and the political models did not really do a good job of explaining how the financial crisis actually occurred, and how do crises actually occur, and how do wars actually occur. Those institutions of knowledge are incapable of explaining those. You have to go into the political, economic, and political philosophical models to find long-term institutional shifts that then result decades later into market failures and economic failures. So I used Hegelian, Friedrich Hegel's Hegelian dialectic. He was a philosopher in the late 1800s, and he was very influential in influencing Marx and Marx's Capital and his critique of capitalism. And really, Marx was the first business cycle economist. So let's take you through the Hegelian dialectic, and this has been updated. So if you go back to the period of before 1915, and in between 1915 and 1945, there was an institutional thesis, both economically, politically, socially, culturally. These were institutions that basically governed society. And back then there was aristocracies, authoritarianism, dictatorships, and fascism. These institutions eventually collapsed, not only under their own weight, but also under their own illegitimacies. Unfortunately, historically, when there are institutional battles between different ideologies or philosophy, it is manifested and reflected through wars, which are extremely destructive from a human standpoint, but also from capital standpoint and from a societal standpoint. What emerges from these wars is a new antithesis, a new institutional frame that emerges to govern society and the economy. After the World War I, World War II, Korean War, Cold War, and proxy wars, you saw a synthesis, a democratic, capitalistic, institutional synthesis. You saw Keynesianism, really advocated by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, bringing in regulatory institutions to oversee Wall Street, pushed through demand side policies to get people back to work and get the economy growing again. You saw centrist political ideologies start to emerge more from the center, less from the extreme left, and you started to see regulated markets. So you go from a thesis through this destructive aspect, an antithesis emerges, and then a new synthesis thesis then establishes itself to be the governing political, economic, ideological frame in which society is governed. Between 1945 and 1975, this democratic, capitalistic, Keynesian, centrist political ideology was basically the norm that governed society. It wasn't until you saw Carter, Kennedy, Reagan emerge after the 70s to see a neo-Keynesian, post-Cold War global capitalism emerge. A new philosophy, a free hand capitalism, deregulated markets, global markets, and allowing the markets to basically correct themselves. Then, between 45 and 75 in this new antithesis, this became the synthesis and the thesis that then ran all the way up until 2007. And if you look at the deregulation, the monetarist philosophy, it really peaked in 2007 where there was really no regulation. The SEC was pretty much de-toothed. The central bank, the Federal Reserve, the comptroller of the currency, the FDIC, was not regulating the banks. You had the Glass-Steagall Act that had been repealed. You had Graham-Leach that came in, which deregulated in 2000. And you also had the mergers in 2000 between commercial banks and investment banks. So you had a merger of investment banks, commercial banks, pure deregulation, which allowed the system to create asset price bubbles through over-accommodation. Not only money from the financial institutions because they were levering up, but also no regulatory oversight, no capital requirements. So the system at that point was pure freehand capitalism. Pure freehand capitalism. Neoliberal economics, monetarism under Friedman, and neoclassical macroeconomic thought became the new antithesis. So the question then becomes, now that that collapsed after 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11, the system collapsed. The government had to step in to cure the market failure. The question then becomes, what is the new synthesis? The new thesis become, what is the new governing institutional, economic, and political ideology that is going to govern society for the next 15 to 30 years? Because if you step back, you can see that the dialectics, on average, last 30 years. So if we've just come through some type of crisis similar to wars, using the Hegelian dialectical analysis, we are basically 5 years into the first 15 years of the 30-year dialectic. Now the question becomes, why does that matter? Well, it does matter, because if you're a pension fund or an endowment or a financial institution or a family office or an individual with children, you're thinking intergenerationally. You have to be thinking 20, 30, 40 years in advance. So if this shift is occurring, it's going to have a direct or indirect impact on the value of your debt and equity. It's going to have an impact on your human capital. So what we need to be able to figure out is what is the institutional frame going to look like. And I think it's going to be a new Keynesian approach. We will reintroduce Keynesian ideologies, and you will see re-regulation, which you saw through Dodd-Frank, progressive democratic policy. The political shift by the Democratic Party has moved to the right and become more progressive, and they actually look more like moderate Republicans. And you'll see more managed markets. And you're seeing that with Dodd-Frank and Basel III as they regulate the derivatives. Or at least they're trying to bring all derivative trading on the exchange to be able to monitor and manage the derivative market, which was basically the tool that took down the system. I'm going to end it there.